Welcome back as we continue our studies of the Greek of the New Testament. You've made it to chapter 14, so congratulations. We're almost halfway through this Machen textbook, and so I appreciate the diligence that you've been putting in, and I hope that this has been rewarding for you. The best is yet to come. As we continue to proceed, we're going to find an increasing facility with the Greek language, and it won't be long before we'll actually begin to see that some of the exercises reflect actual verses and statements that are taken from the New Testament itself. So you're almost there. Keep plugging away and be diligent and be disciplined, and I think you'll find that all of this hard work you're doing is going to pay off in the end. We're coming at this point to chapter 14. The chapter that we're going to be looking at this point really deals with the introduction of what's called the aorist. The aorist is a fancy word for the past tense, the simple past tense in Greek. And so that's the tense that we'll be looking at. You'll notice this is actually the third of the tenses that we have considered. You might say that the imperfect was a separate tense as well, but actually the imperfect is almost considered part of the present tense. But you'll notice we talked about the present tense, action that takes place in present time. The imperfect is referring to action in the past that is continuous in nature. I was walking down the street yesterday. Then, of course, we looked at the future tense, I will walk down the street, and we noted that really forming the future is simply a matter of adding a sigma between the stem of the verb and the ending. So luo becomes luso, and so on. That's fairly straightforward. And now when we come to the aorist, we're going to find a similar kind of arrangement. However, the aorist also makes use of the augment. And so when we look at the aorist, we'll take the word luo, as Machen does. We're going to put the augment at the front of it. Eluon was the imperfect. But for the aorist, it's going to be elusa. And the sigma alpha at the end, and by the way, the alpha is short there, becomes the sign. The sigma alpha becomes the sign of the aorist. And you'll find that all of the endings that are associated with the aorist have that kind of sigma alpha, or at least it's sort of implied there. So elusa, elusas, eluse, that's the exception, has an epsilon at the end. And then elusamen, elusate, elusan. And so those are the endings that we're going to be dealing with. That's the aorist active. The aorist passive is similar, except the endings are slightly different. So it's elusamen, eluso, elusato. Elusamatha, elusastha, elusanto. We'll be learning more about those as we go along, but of course the exercises will give you a chance to work out some facility with those endings, and so as we go along, I think you'll find it fairly straightforward. A couple of things just to note. The aorist is referring to past time, but it's distinct from the imperfect. You recall the imperfect was referring to an ongoing action in the past. I was walking. Whereas the aorist is actually referring to a distinct, or what's sometimes called punctiliar, action in the past. I walked down the street. There's no sense of an ongoing action during which something else may have occurred. I walked down the street yesterday. Really no sense of the time involved, except that it took place at some point in the past. We don't know how long it took to take the walk. Maybe it was 1 second, maybe it was 5 hours, you know. But either way, it's just referring to that distinct act in the past. The aorist, therefore, is distinct from the imperfect in that it is punctiliar rather than linear, and so that's really the language that you want to keep in mind there. It is notable that in English we sometimes translate the aorist using what's called the simple past, and sometimes we use what's called the English perfect. So the English perfect would be something like, I have walked down the street. Now, you want to be careful because in Greek, the perfect tense has a rather peculiar sense to it. We haven't looked at it yet, of course, and when we do, we'll try to explain that more fully. But notice, at least for our present purposes, that you can use either the simple English past tense or the English perfect to translate an aorist tense in Greek. The context is going to make the difference, and sometimes the context is not altogether clear. There's one very famous example of this. You know the verse Romans 3:16, where the Apostle Paul teaches, all have sinned. Well, that's the simple aorist that's found in that verse. But the question is, should we render it all have sinned, which would be a standard way of rendering that verse, probably the way that you've been accustomed to hearing it. But it also is perfectly permissible to translate it all sinned. And if we translate it that way, then of course the at least possible meaning of it is that all sinned in Adam, which is a theme that Paul will take up 2 chapters later in Romans, in chapter 5, when he says, whereas by one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death passed to all men because all sinned. And maybe Paul has the very same sense in mind. My only reason for mentioning that is that even though the context will generally clarify whether you should use the English simple past or the English perfect, you should be cautious because sometimes there can be a little bit of an ambiguity there, and you want to keep your eyes open for that. The other distinctive aspect of this chapter, and a little item that's going to come up, is how we use the word pisteuo. Pisteuo means I believe, and you know that that word can be used in two somewhat different senses. I can say I believe that the Bible is true, and in that sense I'm just giving cognitive assent to the truth claims of the Bible. If I, on the other hand, want to say I believe in something, I believe in Jesus, I believe in God, we would expect, of course, that the way that would be handled in English or in Greek would be pisteuo en. But actually the Greek will use kind of idiomatically the preposition eis. I believe eis, pisteuo eis, ton ieson, I believe in Jesus. And that means really, from the Greek point of view, your belief is not simply in a static sense, but into, as if you're sort of moving into it. It's a rather lovely idea, and we find that in the New Testament that's the common way of expressing the notion of believing in Jesus. So you just want to keep your eye on that as well. And of course the preposition eis will take the accusative, so that would be the normal construction that we'll find. So our agenda for this lesson is, first of all, as we typically do, take a look at the vocabulary words, comment briefly on those. I want to look at the endings associated with the simple aorist, and then we'll do some exercises, and I'll turn you loose from there to proceed. You may notice that Machen calls this the first aorist, and then that implies that there may be another aorist, and you're quite correct if you're assuming that. The next chapter will introduce what's called the second aorist. He mentions in the chapter, and I'll just repeat, there's no difference in the sense. The aorist is the aorist, but it's two different ways of forming the aorist, and usually verbs will be one or the other. You'll either have a first aorist or a second aorist formed on a particular Greek verb. So right now, don't worry about that. Just learn the aorist. This is the simple, straightforward first aorist, and then in the next chapter we'll come back and take a look at the second aorist and notice its distinct features. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look now at the vocabulary words that are going to be part of this lesson. The vocabulary list is looking a little different, you'll notice. We're starting off with a word which is translated I release. It's the Greek word apoluo. You'll see it right here. You notice, of course, again, we have the use of the preposition apa with luo. So it would normally mean something like loose from, but of course idiomatically the idea is that I release. I release someone from bondage, something like that. Maybe release them from a debt. That would be another possible use of it. So this is, of course, the first of the principal parts. The second of them is the future. You've learned the second principal part, and of course all we do here is insert the sigma. So apoluso, I will release. And now here's the third of the principal parts. This is the aorist. It's the new idea we're introducing in this. And notice a couple of things. We have the sigma, which I indicated earlier is going to show up in the aorist as well as the future. But the other thing that changes here is we notice the augment. And you'll recall from prior studies that the augment does not apply to the first letter when it's a compound verb, but rather you augment the letter right before the stem. So the omicron over here becomes an epsilon. The sigma, or I'm sorry, the alpha is short. And so the rules of accent indicate that when you have a short ultima, you are able to accent the antepenult, and the recessive rule of verb accent indicates that that is indeed the syllable that you want to accent. So it's apelusa, I release. The next word we have is ekerugza, ekerugza. We've already had keruso, I preach. The future, you recall, was keruzo, I will preach, and now we augment the beginning of it. And notice again the alpha is short, so we're going to put the accent right here at keruza, I preached. This is the simple aorist, and of course it forms this distinctive ending the same way we did in the future, at keruza. The word kerygma, you may know that from New Testament studies or theological studies, refers to the core message of the New Testament, the gospel. And this word keruso, or akerugza, is of course related to that word. So there's the second of our vocabulary words. The third one now we have is epistrepho. Again, you'll notice it's compound. We have epi, which usually means over or on, and the strepho is a word that's going to suggest some kind of turning. So turning on, the idiomatic sense of it, we can't really make it out simply by the word itself, is going to be to turn or to return. So it has a soft idea of returning. The principal notion of it is just to turn, as in to turn to the Lord. If you were to use that, you would use, by the way, the pros, epistrepho pros, ton kurion, I turn to the Lord. The future here, epistrepso, we've already talked about how the phi is going to become a psi. And of course, we make no change in the prefix here, so it's epi, strepso. But then when we get to the aorist, again, we're going to have the epistrepsa, but notice that the iota here became an epsilon. So following our rule concerning how we augment the epistrepsa, short alpha, put the accent on the antepenult. So epistrepho, epistrepso, epistrepsa. The next word we have is hetoimazo, hetoimazo. Notice first it has a rough breather. Hetoimazo, it means I prepare. This is the word that Jesus uses when he says, I go to prepare a place for you. The future, the zeta becomes a sigma. We've talked about that in the prior lesson. So hetoimaso. And then when we move to the aorist, of course the accent's going to move back. We augment the epsilon. There is no prefix here, no preposition that's being used. So it's he toi masa, he toi masa. So that's the word I prepared. Next word we have is a day. A day is an adverb. It never comes in any form except the one that you have right there. So a day, already. Find that frequently in the New Testament, and that's about all we need to say about that. Thaumazo, thaumazo is I marvel or I wonder at. It's the word commonly used when Jesus performs miracles in the New Testament and the people wondered at it, or they were filled with some kind of sense of wonder at what had happened. Thaumazo is the present. Thaumaso is the future. Again, the zeta becomes a sigma. And a thaumasa is the aorist. I don't know of any English derivatives from that, so you'll just need to learn that. But again, the formulation of it is predictable. Therapeuo, you recognize immediately, of course, that our English word therapy comes from this, and not surprisingly, the word therapeuo means I heal. In English, anything that's therapeutic has a healing character. So therapeuo, the future is therapeuso, adding the sigma. And in the aorist, it's a therapusa, the accent there on the antepenult. And otherwise, it's pretty predictable. The next word is peitho. Peitho means I persuade. I don't have any English derivatives for this one either, but peitho has a theta there. Of course, when we go to the future, the theta becomes a sigma. That's pursuant to the rules we've already heard, peso. And then epesa, accent on the antepenult, I persuaded. Next word, pistuo. As you can imagine, this word occurs quite frequently in the New Testament. It means I believe, pistuo. Future, pistuso, I will believe. And the aorist, epistusa, I believed or I have believed. As I was mentioning to you earlier, if you're going to express the idea of believing in, as in believing in God, then this would use the preposition eis. So pistuo ace would be the common way of expressing that. If you're simply using the idea of believing something to be true, then of course you wouldn't use that particular preposition. Finally, hupastrepho means I return in a more distinct sense. You noticed epistrepho can mean I return. In some ways they're synonymous, but this word only means I return. Epistrepho can mean to turn and return in a somewhat more ambiguous sense. This one is pretty distinct, so I return is the idea. I'd like to just discuss with you briefly Machen's description of how the first aorist operates. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to note Machen's description, he says the first aorist here is not different in tense from the second aorist. As I was saying earlier, the first and second aorist are the same in their meaning. They're simply two different ways of forming the same tense. He says we have something like this in English. For example, we have the English expression, I loved, and that's not a different tense from I threw. They're both the past tense. And as you can see, we form the past tense in two rather different ways. So the way in which the Greek will form the past tense is something like that. With some verbs, it's a kind of regular way, as we in English would add ed to a verb, whereas in some cases it's a different kind of configuration, and that's called the second aorist. He also notes that the aorist is like the imperfect in that it refers to action in past time. But the imperfect that we've already studied refers to action in an ongoing sense. He mentions here, I was loosing. That would be the simple sense of the imperfect, whereas the aorist is simply the reference to the past time, I loosed, you see. The difference is sometimes called the difference between linear action and punctiliar action. He notes that in the present tense, the distinction between punctiliar and linear action, I walk, I am walking, is not observed very carefully, but in the past, of course, the distinction is observed even more sharply than in English. So as Machen notes here on page 82, the Greek language has no tendency whatsoever to confuse the aorist with the imperfect. The ongoing linear action in the past will be reflected by the imperfect, whereas the aorist has a more punctiliar sense. But having said that, he proceeds to explain an even more subtle point here. I alluded to this earlier, that sometimes the aorist can be rendered by what's called the English perfect. The English perfect uses the word have, so it would be, for example, I have loosed, whereas the simple past tense is simply I loosed. You know that there's a subtle difference in English between the meaning of I have loosed and the meaning of I loosed. And sometimes it's not altogether clear when you're reading the Greek text which of those English renderings you should be using. I was referring earlier to the case of Romans 3:23, all sinned or all have sinned, which is the intended sense. It could have some theological bearing on how you interpret that particular verse. I would suggest that you read this paragraph 169 closely and carefully and make note of it. He notes down here at 170, the context will usually determine quite clearly whether an aorist is to be translated in English by the simple past tense or by the imperfect. Sometimes it's altogether clear, sometimes it's not so clear. This becomes part of the subtlety of dealing with the Greek text, and so I'm going to leave it to you to think about that more as you go along. But just be aware that either of those can be used in any given setting, and it's up to you as the translator to think about which is going to be a more reasonable rendering of the Greek text as you're bringing it into the English language. Let's go ahead and take a look at the paradigm here for luo. I just wanted to highlight for you the endings. We have elusa, elusas, eluset. And of course you'll notice all three of these are obviously short. You know that they're short because if the accent is on the antepenult, then the ultima must be short. If it were long, then you couldn't accent it any further back than the penult. Elusamen, elusata, elusan are the plural side. Once again, you'll notice these endings are not overly surprising. Sometimes the alpha is called the sign of the aorist. Alpha aorist may be a way to remember that. And so typically when you're looking at Greek words and you see that sigma alpha, then you can at least imagine that the likelihood is it's going to be the aorist, and for the most part you'll probably be right. When we come to the aorist middle, not the passive, by the way, the aorist passive has a distinct formulation of the stem, but in the aorist middle we have these endings: elusamein, eluso, elusato, and then elusamata, notice the alpha, elusasta, elusanto. You'll notice that these are somewhat similar to the imperfect middle endings: eluamein, eluu, elueto, eluamatha, eluesta, eluanto. So there's some similarity there. You should find that the memorizing you've already done will pay off as you add these endings, but they are somewhat distinct, so be sure to get clear in your mind the difference between the two. And so that's really all we need to look at in this chapter before we go ahead and take some exercises, so let's do that now. The first exercise, the translation exercises going from Greek to English, is before us here: apellesen, ho kyrios ton doulon autou, hoda doulos, uk apellusa ton allon. So, what are we going to make of this? Well, we notice first of all that we have what appears to be an aorist. We see the sigma with the epsilon ending. It tells us it must be the first or the third person singular. We notice the augment, apellusen, and of course we also remember from the vocabulary list that apelluo means I release. So this is going to be the aorist, third person singular, he released. Looking for a subject in the sentence, we see ho kyrios in the nominative case, so the Lord released. Ton doulon, accusative, of course the direct object, the Lord released the slave autou of him, comma, hoda doulos, the but slave, and of course translate that, but the slave, uk apellusa, did not release. Same form as this one up here, except we don't have the movable nu because we don't have a vowel here. Uk apellusa, did not release, ton allon, the other. This, of course, is an allusion to the parable that you probably are familiar with in the New Testament. The Lord released his slave, but the slave did not release the other. All right, the second of the exercises: ede, epistrepson, hutoi pros ton kyrion, akenoi da epistrepsusen, in tais hemerais tais kakais. Well, we remember this adverb already. Epistrepson, you recall from epistrepho, means return or turn. We're not sure which yet, but we notice that it has this sigma alpha ending and it's augmented, so we know that it's the aorist. So already, and by the way, we notice that the alpha nu here at the end is evidently the third person plural, so it's going to be they turned or they returned. We're not sure which yet. We're going to hold that in abeyance for a moment. Already they turned or returned. Well, who did it? Here we have the nominative, plural, masculine, these. Nothing else goes with it, so we're going to imply into it these men. Already these men turned, and then pros ton kyrion. So it's probably going to be turned. These men turned, pros ton kyrion, to the Lord. Akenoi, those, but those, epistrepsusen. Now notice here we have epistrepso put into the future. Those, third person plural, will return in the, dative plural, in the days, the evil ones. So these men already turned to the Lord, but those will return in the evil days. And the third of our translation exercises: epistusamen eis ton kyrion kai sose hemas. All right, well, epistusamen, we recognize that from the verb pistuo, I believe. It's augmented and has the sigma alpha, so we know this is going to be the aorist. It's the first person plural, so it's we believed, or we have believed, it could be. And then notice the use of ace, as we were indicating earlier, ace, tone, kurion, idiomatically, into the Lord, but we'll just render it, we believed in the Lord, kai, sose. This is from sozo, but notice the sign of the future here. It's not augmented, so it's going to be future. We believed in the Lord, and he will save hemas, us. We believed in the Lord, and he will save us. Well, now we come to the slightly more challenging project of translating from English to Greek. So I'm looking at the first of these composition exercises. It's on page 86 in the text that I'm using here, and I assume yours is probably the same. But it reads in English, we did not receive the gospel because we did not hear the voice of the apostle. So we did not receive, and we are going to use the negation, uk, and then receive. The only word we know for which we can form the past tense, the aorist tense, is dekomai. We also know the word lambano, but we don't know how to form the past tense on that. That's actually going to be a second aorist, and so we'll save that for later. So the only word at our disposal to render this sentence is going to be dekomai. We augment it, so it's going to be and then we also turn the kappa into a gazi, so it's going to be edegs. And then you recall that the middle ending is applied because this is a deponent verb. And so, uk edexamatha, we did not receive, takes the accusative, ta euangelion, the gospel, neuter, and so we have the neuter article there. We did not receive the gospel, hoti, because, uk ekusamen. This is from aku, of course. We've augmented the alpha. We have the normal active ending here, because this is not deponent. So, because we did not hear, takes the genitive, very commonly, tes phones, the voice, to apostolu, of the apostle. So if you came up with something like that, then you should be in pretty good shape. Let's take a look at the second exercise. Again, reading the text in the textbook here. In those days, we were not believing in the Lord, but this disciple persuaded us. So what do we have? Well, in, of course, the preposition takes the dative in akenes, those, it's a feminine noun, tes, or tais, I should say, in akenes, tais, hemerais, in those, the days. That should be easy for you by now. We've done a lot of those. Uk is the negation, and then epistuomen. Notice that it's the imperfect. In those days, we were not believing. And so we're not going to use the aorist here. We're going to use the imperfect. Epistuomen, we were not believing, ace, ton, kurion, in the Lord. We've learned how to use the preposition along with pistuo in this chapter. But I've used Allah here, contracted it before the vowel, Allah, hutos, but this, and then ha mathetes, now masculine noun of the first declension, but this disciple persuaded. We need to augment it, and we need to include the sigma. So epesen, this disciple persuaded hemas, us. So that hopefully makes sense. That's the way you would do that sentence. And let's take a look at the last one. The last sentence reads from the text here, the sinner turned unto the Lord and already is being taught by him. So the sinner turned to the Lord, and so we're going to have ho hamartelos, word we've already looked at before in a previous chapter. Turned, this is going to be epistrepsa, because it's not returned in the text here. It's the sinner turned. We augment here, so the iota becomes an epsilon, and we add the psi to form the aorist. So the sinner turned, then prostone kurion. You notice in the text it said unto the Lord, but that's idiomatically still going to use the pros. So The sinner turned pros ton kurion to the Lord, kai ade already, and then this is in the present tense, and it is the third person singular passive present, so it's is being taught and already is being taught. The sinner is already being taught hupautu by him. So there you go. Those are the first three of our exercises, and I'm going to leave it to you to go ahead and work through the rest of these exercises. As always, I've given you the answer key on the website, so go ahead and take a look at that or download it. Again, my suggestion is that as you do each exercise, you immediately check your work, and if you see that there's a problem that's slipped in, then you can correct it and try to figure out exactly what's going on. And hopefully as you go through them, you'll find that these exercises make sense and that you'll be ready to move on to the next chapter. So again, it's been really nice to have you here with me. I hope that this has been helpful, and we'll look forward to seeing you again once you finish these exercises and feel ready to go, and we'll move on to chapter 15. So until then, God's richest blessing on you and on your studies of Greek, and we'll see you next time.